When Mary Lennox was sent to Misselthwaite Manor to live with her uncle, everybody said she was the most disagreeable-looking child ever seen. It was true, too. She had a thin little face and a thin little body, thin light hair and a sour expression. Her hair was yellow, and her face was yellow because she had been born in India and had always been ill in one way or another. She hated the people with whom she had to stay, until her uncle, Archibald Craven, sent a servant to take her in charge. She especially hated the children, and was glad when Mrs. Medlock arrived to take her to Mr. Craven's home. They had called her Mistress Mary Quite Contrary, and there was a deal of truth to it. Mr. Craven had sent for Mrs. Medlock and given her orders. "Captain Lennox and his wife died of the cholera," Mr. Craven had said in his short, cold way. "Captain Lennox was my wife's brother, and I am their daughter's guardian. The child is to be brought here. You must go to London and bring her yourself." So she packed her small trunk and made the journey. Mary sat in her corner of a railway carriage and looked plain and fretful. She had nothing to read or to look at, and she had folded her thin little black-gloved hands in her lap. Her black dress made her look yellower than ever, and her limp, light hair straggled from under her black crape hat. "I suppose I might as well tell you something about where you're going to," said Mrs. Medlock. "Do you know anything about your uncle?" "No," said Mary. "Humph," muttered Mrs. Medlock, staring at her queer, unresponsive little face. She did not say any more for a few minutes, and then she began again. "I suppose you might as well be told something to prepare you. You're going to a queer place." Mary said nothing at all, and Mrs. Medlock looked rather discomfited by her apparent indifference, but after taking a breath, she went on. "Not but that it's a grand big place in a gloomy way, and Mr. Craven's proud of it in his way, and that's gloomy enough too. The house is 600 years old, and it's on the edge of the moor, and there's near 100 rooms in it, though most of them shut up and locked. And there's pictures and fine old furniture and things that's been there for ages, and there's a big park round it and gardens and trees with branches trailing to the ground, some of them." She paused and took another breath. "But there's nothing else," she ended suddenly. Mary had begun to listen in spite of herself. "Well," said Mrs. Medlock, "what do you think of it?" "Nothing," she answered. "I know nothing about such places." "Mr. Craven's got a crooked back," said Mrs. Medlock. "That set him wrong. He was a sour young man and got no good of all his money and big place till he was married. Now she was a sweet, pretty young thing, and he'd have walked the world over to get her a blade of grass she wanted. Nobody thought she'd marry him, but she did, and people said she married him for his money. But she didn't. She didn't. Positively. When she died—" Mary gave a little involuntary jump. "Oh, did she die?" she exclaimed, quite without meaning to. "Yes, she died," Mrs. Medlock answered, "and it made him queerer than ever. He cares about nobody, he won't see people. You needn't expect to see him, because 10 to 1 you won't, and you mustn't expect that there will be people to talk to you. You'll have to play about and look after yourself. You'll be told what rooms you can go into and what rooms you're to keep out of. There's gardens enough. But when you're in the house, don't go wandering and poking about. Mr. Craven won't have it." "I shall not want to go poking about," said sour little Mary. She slept a long time, and when she awakened, Mrs. Medlock was shaking her. "You have had a sleep," she said. "It's time to open your eyes. We're at Thwaite Station, and we've got a long drive before us." The station was a small one, and nobody but themselves seemed to be getting out of the train. A brougham stood on the road before the little outside platform. Mary saw that it was a smart carriage, and that it was a smart footman who helped her in. "What is a moor?" she said suddenly to Mrs. Medlock. "Look out of the window in about 10 minutes and you'll see," the woman answered. "We've got to drive 5 miles across Missel Moor before we get to the manor. You won't see much because it's a dark night, but you can see something." Mary leaned forward and pressed her face against the window just as the carriage gave a big jolt. We're on the moor now, sure enough," said Mrs. Medlock. The carriage lamps shed a yellow light on a rough-looking road, which seemed to be cut through bushes and low-growing things, which ended in the great expanse of dark, apparently spread out before and around them. A wind was rising and making a singular, wild, low, rushing sound. It's not the sea, is it?" said Mary, looking round at her companion. No, not it, answered Mrs. Medlock. Nor it isn't fields nor mountains, it's just miles and miles of wild land that nothing grows on but heather and gorse and broom, and nothing lives on but wild ponies and sheep. It's a wild, dreary enough place to my mind, though there's plenty that likes it, particularly when the heather's in bloom. I don't like it, Mary said to herself. I don't like it. And she pinched her thin lips more tightly together. The horses were climbing up a hilly piece of road when she first caught sight of a light. Mrs. Medlock saw it as soon as she did, and drew a long sigh of relief. "I am glad to see that bit of light twinkling," she exclaimed. "It's the light in the lodge window. We shall get a good cup of tea after a bit, at all events." It was after a bit, as she said, for when the carriage passed through the park gates, there was still 2 miles of avenue to drive through, and the trees, which nearly met overhead, made it seem as if they were driving through a long, dark vault. A neat, thin old man stood near the manservant who opened the door for them. Mary Lennox was led up a broad staircase and down a long corridor and up a short flight of steps and through another corridor and another until a door opened in a wall, and she found herself in a room with a fire in it and a supper on the table. Mrs. Medlock said unceremoniously, "Well, here you are, this room and the next are where you'll live, and you must keep to them, don't you forget that." It was in this way Mistress Mary arrived at Misselthwaite Manor, and she had perhaps never felt quite so contrary in all her life. When she opened her eyes in the morning, it was because a young housemaid had come into her room to light the fire, and was kneeling on the hearth-rug, raking out the cinders noisily. "What is that?" she said, pointing out of the window. Martha, the young housemaid, who had just risen to her feet, looked and pointed also. "That there?" she said. "Yes." "That's the moor," with a good-natured grin. "Does thou like it?" "No," answered Mary, "I hate it." "That's because thou'rt not used to it," Martha said, going back to her hearth. "Thou thinks it's too big and bare now, but thou wilt like it." "Do you?" inquired Mary. "Aye, that I do," answered Martha, cheerfully polishing away at the grate. "I just love it. It's none bare. It's covered with growing things as smell sweet. It's fair lovely in spring and summer when the gorse and broom and heather's in flower. It smells of honey, and there's such a lot of fresh air, and the sky looks so high, and the bees and skylarks make such a nice noise, humming and singing. I wouldn't live away from the moor for anything. It's time for thee to get up now. Mrs. Medlock said I was to carry thy breakfast and tea and dinner into the room next to this." If Mary Lennox had been a child who was ready to be amused, she would perhaps have laughed at Martha's readiness to talk. But Mary only listened to her coldly and wondered at her freedom of manner. At first she was not at all interested, but gradually, as the girl rattled on in her good-tempered, homely way, Mary began to notice what she was saying. You should see 'em all," she said. "There's 12 of us, and my father only gets 16 shilling a week. I can tell you my mother's put to it to get porridge for 'em all. They tumble about on the moor and play there all day, and mother says the air of the moor fattens 'em. She says she believes they eat the grass same as the wild ponies do. Our Dickon, he's 12 years old, and he's got a young pony he calls his own." "Where did he get it?" asked Mary. "He found it on the moor, with its mother when it was a little one, and he began to make friends with it and give it bits of bread and pluck young grass for it, and it got to like him so it follows him about and lets him get on its back. Dickon's a kind lad, and animals likes him." It was really this mention of Dickon which made Mary decide to go out, though she was not aware of it. There would be birds outside, though there would not be ponies or sheep. They would be different from the birds in India, and it might amuse her to look at them. Martha found her coat and hat for her and a pair of stout little boots, and she showed her her way downstairs. "If thou goes round that way, thou come to the garden," she said, pointing to a gate in a wall of the shrubbery. "There's lots of flowers in summer-time, but there's nothing blooming now." She seemed to hesitate a second before she added, "One of the gardens is locked up. No one has been in it for 10 years. "Why?" asked Mary, in spite of herself. Here was another locked door added to the 100 in the strange house. "Mr. Craven had it shut when his wife died so sudden. He won't let no one go inside. It was her garden. He locked the door and dug a hole and buried the key. There's Mrs. Medlock's bell ringing. I must run." After she was gone, Mary turned down the walk which led to the door in the shrubbery. Presently an old man with a spade over his shoulder walked through the door leading from the second garden. He looked startled when he saw Mary, and then touched his cap. He had a surly old face and didn't seem at all pleased to see her, but then she was displeased with his garden and wore her quite contrary expression, and certainly did not seem at all pleased to see him. "What is this place?" she asked. "One of the kitchen gardens," he answered. "What is that?" said Mary, pointing through another green door. "Another of 'em," shortly. "There's another on t'other side of the wall, and there's the orchard on the other side of that." "Can I go in them?" asked Mary. "If thou likes, but there's naught to see." Mary made no response. She went down the path and through the second green door. She could see the tops of trees above the wall, and when she stood still she saw a bird with a bright red breast sitting on the topmost branch of one of them, and suddenly he burst into his winter song, almost as if he had caught sight of her and was calling to her. "I believe that tree was in the secret garden. I feel sure it was," she said. "There was a wall round the place, and there was no door." She walked back into the first kitchen garden she had entered, and found the old man digging there. She went and stood beside him, and watched him a few moments in her cold little way. He took no notice of her, and so at last she spoke to him. "I have been into the other gardens," she said. "There wasn't nothing to prevent thee," he answered crustily. "I went into the orchard. There was no dog at the door to bite thee," he answered. "There was no door there into the other garden," said Mary. "What garden?" he said in a rough voice, stopping his digging for a moment. "The one on the other side of the wall," answered Mistress Mary. "There are trees there. I saw the tops of them. A bird with a red breast was sitting on one of them, and he sang." "What kind of bird is he?" Mary asked. "Doesn't thou know? He's a robin redbreast, and they're the friendliest, curiousest birds alive." "He's a conceited one," he chuckled. "He likes to hear folk talk about him. And curious, bless me, there never was his like for curiosity and meddling. He always comes to see what I'm planting. He knows all the things Mr. Craven never troubles himself to find out. He's the head gardener, he is." Suddenly a clear, rippling little sound broke out near her, and she turned round. She was standing a few feet from a young apple tree, and the robin had flown onto one of its branches and had burst out into a scrap of song. Ben Weatherstaff laughed outright. "What did he do that for?" asked Mary. "He's made up his mind to make friends with thee," replied Ben. "Dang me if he hasn't took a fancy to thee." "To me," said Mary, and she moved towards the little tree softly and looked up. "Would you make friends with me?" she said to the robin, just as if she was speaking to a person. "Would you?" But just that moment the robin, who had ended his song, gave a little shake of his wings, spread them, and flew away. He had made his visit and had other things to do. "He has flown over the wall," Mary cried out, watching him. "He has flown into the orchard. He has flown across the other wall, into the garden where there is no door. None as anyone can find, and none as it's anyone's business. Don't you be a meddlesome wench and poke your nose where it's got no cause to go. Here, I must go on with my work. Get you gone and play you, I've no more time." And he actually stopped digging, threw his spade over his shoulder, and walked off without even glancing at her or saying goodbye. She stayed out of doors nearly all day, and when she sat down to her supper at night she felt hungry and drowsy and comfortable. She did not feel cross when Martha chattered away. She felt as if she rather liked to hear her, and at last she thought she would ask her a question. She asked it after she had finished her supper and had sat down at the hearth-rug before the fire. "Why did Mr. Craven hate the garden?" she said. Then Martha gave up her store of knowledge. "Mind," she said, "Mrs. Medlock said it's not to be talked about. There's lots of things in this place that's not to be talked over. That's Mr. Craven's orders. His troubles are none servant's business, he says. But for the garden, he wouldn't be like he is. It was Mrs. Craven's garden that she had made when first they were married, and she just loved it, and they used to tend the flowers themselves, and none of the gardeners was ever to let go in. Him and her used to go in and shut the door and stay there hours and hours, reading and talking. And she was just a bit of a girl, and there was an old tree with a branch bent like a seat on it, and she made roses grow over it, and she used to sit there. But one day when she was sitting there, the branch broke, and she fell on the ground, and was hurt so bad that next day she died. The doctors thought he'd go out of his mind and died too. That's why he hates it. No one's ever gone in since, and he won't let anyone talk about it. Mary did not ask any more questions. She looked at the red fire and listened to the wind wuthering. It seemed to be wuthering louder than ever. But as she was listening to the wind, she began to listen to something else. She did not know what it was, because at first she could scarcely distinguish it from the wind itself. It was a curious sound. It seemed almost as if a child were crying somewhere. Sometimes the wind sounded rather like a child crying, but presently Mistress Mary felt quite sure that this sound was inside the house, not outside it. It was far away, but it was inside. She turned round and looked at Martha. "Do you hear anyone crying?" she said. Martha suddenly looked confused. "No, no," she answered, "it's the wind. Sometimes it sounds like as if someone was lost on the moor and wailing. It's got all sorts of sounds." "But listen," said Mary, "it is in the house, down one of those long corridors." And at that very moment a door must have been opened somewhere downstairs, for a great rushing draught blew along the passage, and the door of the room they sat in was blown open with a crash, and as they both jumped to their feet, the light was blown out, and the crying sound was swept down the far corridor, so that it was to be heard more plainly than ever. "There," said Mary, "I told you so. It is someone crying, and it isn't a grown-up person." Two days after this, when Mary opened her eyes, she sat upright in bed immediately and called to Martha. "Look at the moor! Look at the moor!" The rainstorm had ended, and the grey mist and clouds had been swept away in the night by the wind. The wind itself had ceased, and a brilliant deep blue sky arched high over the moorland. Never, never had Mary dreamed of a sky so blue. She went out into the garden as quickly as possible. She heard a chirp and a twitter, and when she looked at the bare flower bed on her left side, there the robin was hopping about and pretending to peck things out of the earth to persuade her that he had not followed her. But she knew he had followed her, and the surprise so filled her with delight that she almost trembled a little. "You do remember me," she cried out. "You do. You are prettier than anything else in the world." She chirped and talked and coaxed, and he hopped and flirted his tail and twittered. There were tall shrubs and low ones which grew together at the back of the bed, and as the robin hopped about under them, she saw him hop over a small pile of freshly turned up earth. He stopped on it to look for a worm. The earth had been turned up because a dog had been trying to dig up a mole, and he had scratched quite a deep hole. Mary looked at it, not really knowing why the hole was there, and as she looked she saw something almost buried in the newly turned soil. It was something like a ring of dusty iron or brass, and when the robin flew up into a tree nearby, she put out her hand and picked the ring up. It was more than a ring, however. It was an old key, which looked as if it had been buried a long time. Mistress Mary stood up and looked at it with an almost frightened face as it hung from her finger. "Perhaps it has been buried for 10 years, she said in a whisper. "Perhaps it is the key to the garden." Mrs. Medlock had allowed Martha to sleep all night at the cottage, but she was back at her work in the morning with cheeks redder than ever and in the best of spirits. Presently Martha went out of the room and came back with something held in her hands under the apron. "What does thou think?" she said with a cheerful grin. "I have brought thee a present." "A present?" exclaimed Mistress Mary. "How could a cottage full of 14 hungry people give anyone a present?" "A man was driving across the moor peddling," Martha explained, "and he stopped his cart at our door. He had pots and pans and odds and ends, but Mother had no money to buy anything. Just as he was going away, our Elizabeth Ellen called out, 'Mother, he's got skipping ropes with red and blue handles.' And Mother, she calls out quite suddenly, 'Here, stop, mister, how much are they?' And he says, 'Twopence.' And Mother, she began fumbling in her pocket, and she says to me, 'Martha, thou's brought me thy wages like a good lass, and I've got 4 places to put every penny, but I'm just going to take 2pence out of it to buy that child a skipping rope.' And she bought one, and here it is." She brought it out from under her apron and exhibited it quite proudly. It was a strong, slender rope with a striped blue and red handle at each end. But Mary Lennox had never seen a skipping rope before. She gazed at it with a mystified expression. "What is it for?" she asked curiously. "For?" cried out Martha. "Does that mean that they have not got skipping ropes in India, for all they've got elephants and tigers and camels? This is what it's for. Just watch me." And she ran into the middle of the room and, taking a handle in each hand, began to skip and skip and skip, while Mary turned in her chair to stare at her. "I could skip longer than that," she said, when she stopped. "I've skipped as much as 500 when I was 12, but I wasn't as fat then as I am now, and I was in practice." Mary got up from her chair, beginning to feel excited herself. "It looks nice," she said. "Oh, your mother is a kind woman. Do you think I could ever skip like that?" It was plain there was not a great deal of strength in Mistress Mary's arms and legs when she first began to skip. She was not very clever at it, but she liked it so much that she did not want to stop. "Put on thy things and run and skip out of doors," said Martha. "Mother said I must tell you to keep out of doors as much as you could, even when it rains a bit, so as thou wrap up warm." Mary put on her coat and hat and took her skipping rope over her arm. She opened the door to go out, and then suddenly thought of something, and turned back rather slowly. "Martha," she said, "they were your wages. It was your 2pence, really. Thank you." She said it stiffly because she was not used to thanking people or noticing that they did things for her. "Thank you," she said, and held out her hand, because she did not know what else to do. Mistress Mary felt a little awkward as she went out of the room. Yorkshire people seemed strange, and Martha was always rather a puzzle to her. At first she disliked her very much, but now she did not. Mary skipped round all the gardens and round the orchard, resting every few minutes. She stopped with a little laugh of pleasure, and there, lo and behold, was the robin swaying on a long branch of ivy. He had followed her, and he greeted her with a chirp. As Mary had skipped toward him, she felt something heavy in her pocket strike against her at each jump, and when she saw the robin, she laughed again. "You showed me where the key was yesterday," she said. "You ought to show me the door today, but I don't believe you know." Suddenly a gust of wind swung aside some loose ivy trails, and more suddenly still she jumped toward it and caught it in her hand. There was a round knob which had been covered by the leaves hanging over it. It was the knob of a door. She took a long breath and looked behind her up the long walk to see if anyone was coming. No one was coming. No one ever did come, it seemed, and she took another long breath because she couldn't help it, and she held back the swinging curtain of ivy and pushed back the door, which opened slowly, slowly. Then she slipped through it and shut it behind her and stood with her back against it, looking about her and breathing quite fast with excitement and wonder and delight. She was standing inside the secret garden. "How still it is," she whispered. "How still." Then she waited a moment and listened at the stillness. The robin, who had flown to his treetop, was still as all the rest. He did not even flutter his wings. He sat without stirring and looked at Mary. "No wonder it is still," she whispered again. "I am the first person who has spoken in here for 10 years. She moved away from the door, stepping as softly as if she were afraid of awakening someone. She was glad that there was grass under her feet and that her steps made no sounds. She walked under one of the fairy-like grey arches between the trees and looked up at the sprays and tendrils which formed them. "I wonder if they are all quite dead," she said. "Is it all a quite dead garden? I wish it wasn't." "It isn't a quite dead garden," she cried out softly to herself. "Even if the roses are dead, there are other things alive." She did not know anything about gardening, but the grass seemed so thick in some of the places where the green points were pushing their way through that she thought they didn't seem to have room enough to grow. She searched about until she found a rather sharp piece of wood, and knelt down and dug and weeded out the weeds and grass until she made nice little clear spaces around them. "Now they look as if they could breathe," she said after she'd finished with the first ones. "I'm going to do ever so many more. I'll do all I can see. If I haven't time today, I can come tomorrow." Mistress Mary worked in her garden until it was time to go to her midday dinner. Then she ran lightly across the grass, pushed open the slow old door, and slipped through it under the ivy. She had such red cheeks and such bright eyes and ate such a dinner that Martha was delighted. "I wish the spring was here now," said Mary. "I want to see all the things that grow in England." She'd finished her dinner and gone to her favourite seat on the hearth-rug. I wish I had a little spade," she said. "I thought if I had a little spade, I could dig somewhere and make a little garden." "Well," was Martha's reflective answer, "at Thwaite Village there's a shop or so, and I saw little garden sets with a spade and a rake and a fork all tied up together for 2 shillings, and they were stout enough to work with, too." "I've got more than that in my purse," said Mary. "Mrs. Morrison gave me 5 shillings, and Mrs. Medlock gave me some money from Mr. Craven." "My word, that's riches," said Martha. "Thou can buy anything in the world thou wants. The rent of our cottage is only 1 and 3pence, and it's like pulling eye teeth to get it. Now I've just thought of something," putting her hands on her hips. "What?" said Mary eagerly. "In the shop at Thwaite they sell packages of flower seeds for 1 penny each, and our Dickon, he knows which is the prettiest ones and how to make 'em grow. He walks over to Thwaite many a day just for the fun of it. Dost thou know how to print letters?" Suddenly. I know how to write," Mary answered. Then it was a serious piece of work to write to Dickon. "We'll put the money in the envelope, and I'll get the butcher's boy to take it in his cart. He's a great friend of Dickon's," said Martha. "How shall I get the things when Dickon buys them?" asked Mary. "He'll bring them to you himself. He'll like to walk over this way." "Oh," exclaimed Mary, "then I shall see him. I never thought I should see Dickon." "Does thou want to see him?" asked Martha suddenly. She looked so pleased. "Yes, I do. I never saw a boy foxes and crows loved. I want to see him very much." There was a laurel-hedged walk which curved round the secret garden and ended at a gate which opened into a wood in the park. She thought she would skip round this walk and look into the wood and see if there were any rabbits hopping about. It was a very strange thing indeed. She quite caught her breath as she stopped to look at it. A boy was sitting under the tree with his back against it, playing on a rough wooden pipe. He was a funny-looking boy, about 12. He looked very clean, and his nose turned up, and his cheeks were as red as poppies, and never had Mistress Mary seen such round and such blue eyes in any boy's face. And on the trunk of the tree he leaned against, a brown squirrel was clinging and watching him, and from behind a bush nearby a cock pheasant was delicately stretching his neck to peep out, and quite near him were 2 rabbits sitting up and sniffing with tremulous noses, and actually it appeared as if they were all drawing near to watch him and listen to the strange low little call his pipe seemed to make. When he saw Mary, he held up his hand and spoke to her in a voice almost as low as, and rather like, his piping. "I'm Dickon," the boy said. "I know that, Miss Mary." Then Mary realized that somehow she had known at first that he was Dickon. Who else could have been charming rabbits and pheasants as the natives charm snakes in India? He had a wide, red, curving mouth, and his smile spread all over his face. Did you get Martha's letter?" she asked. He nodded his curly, rust-coloured head. "That's why I come. He stooped to pick up something which had been lying on the ground beside him when he piped. "Let us sit down on this log and look at them," she said. They sat down, and he took a clumsy little brown paper package out of his coat pocket. He untied the string, and inside there were ever so many neater and smaller packages with a picture of a flower on each one. "There's a lot of mignonettes and poppies," he said. "Mignonette's the sweetest smelling thing as grows, and it'll grow wherever you cast it, same as poppies will. Them as'll come up and bloom. Thou's got a bit of a garden, hasn't thou?" Dickon said. She held her hands even tighter and turned her eyes towards him. "I don't know anything about boys," she said slowly. "Could you keep a secret if I told you one? It's a great secret. I don't know what I should do if anyone found it out. I believe I should die." She said the last sentence quite fiercely. Mistress Mary did not mean to put out her hand and clutch his sleeve, but she did it. "I've stolen a garden," she said very fast. "It isn't mine. It isn't anybody's. Nobody wants it. Nobody cares for it. Nobody ever goes into it. Perhaps everything is dead in it already. I don't know." She began to feel hot and as contrary as she had ever felt in her life. "I don't care. I don't care. Nobody has any right to take it from me when I care about it and they don't. They're letting it die all shut in by itself," she ended passionately, and she threw her arms over her face and burst out crying. Poor little Mistress Mary. Dickon's curious blue eyes grew rounder and rounder. "Hey," he said, drawing his exclamation out slowly. The way he did it meant both wonder and sympathy. "I've nothing to do," said Mary. "Nothing belongs to me. I found it myself, and I got into it myself. I was only just like the robin, and they wouldn't take it from the robin." "Where is it?" asked Dickon in a dropped voice. "Come with me, and I'll show you," she said. She led him round the laurel path and to the walk where the ivy grew so quickly. Dickon followed her with a queer, almost pitying look on his face. He felt as if he were being led to look at some strange bird's nest and must move softly. When she stepped to the wall and lifted the hanging ivy, he started. There was a door, and Mary pushed it slowly open, and they passed in together, and then Mary stood and waved her hand round defiantly. "It's this," she said. "It's a secret garden, and I'm the only one in the world who wants it to be alive." Dickon looked round and round about it, and round again. "Hey," he almost whispered, "it's a queer, pretty place. It's like as if a body was in a dream." "I never thought I'd see this place," he said at last in a whisper. "Did you know about the garden?" she asked again when she'd recovered herself. Dickon nodded. "Martha told me there was one as no one ever went inside," he answered. "Us used to wonder what it was like." "Why," he cried, pointing to the grass a few feet away, "who did that there?" It was one of Mary's own little clearings round the pale green points. "I did it," said Mary. "Thou was right," he said. "A gardener couldn't have told thee better. They'll grow now like Jack's beanstalk. They're crocuses and snowdrops, and these here is narcissuses," turning to another patch, "and here's daffodillies. They will be a sight." "Will you come again and help me to do it?" Mary begged. "I'm sure I can help too. I can dig and pull up weeds and do whatever you tell me. Oh, do come, Dickon." "I'll come every day if thou wants me, rain or shine," he answered stoutly. "It's the best fun I've ever had in my life, shut in here and wakening up a garden." That night she'd been lying awake, turning from side to side for about an hour, when suddenly something made her sit up in bed and turn her head toward the door, listening. She listened, and she listened. "It isn't the wind now," she said in a loud whisper. "That isn't the wind. It is different. It is that crying I heard before." The door of her room was ajar, and the sound came down the corridor, a far-off, faint sound of fretful crying. The sound had come up that passage. So she went on with her dim light, almost feeling her way, her heart beating so loud that she fancied she could hear it. The far-off faint crying went on and led her. Sometimes it stopped for a moment or so, and then began again. Was this the right corner to turn? She stopped and thought. Yes, it was. Down this passage, and then to the left, and then up 2 broad steps, and then to the right again. Yes, there was a tapestry door. She pushed it open very gently and closed it behind her, and she stood in the corridor and could hear the crying quite plainly, though it was not loud. It was on the other side of the wall at her left, and a few yards farther on there was a door. She could see a glimmer of light coming from beneath it. The someone was crying in that room, and it was quite a young someone. So she walked to the door and pushed it open, and there she was, standing in the room. It was a big room with ancient, handsome furniture in it. There was a low fire glowing faintly on the hearth, and a nightlight burning by the side of a carved four-posted bed hung with brocade, and on the bed was lying a boy, crying fretfully. The boy had a sharp, delicate face the color of ivory, and he seemed to have eyes too big for it. He had also a lot of hair, which tumbled over his forehead in heavy locks and made his thin face seem smaller. He looked like a boy who had been ill, but he was crying more as if he were tired and cross than as if he were in pain. Mary stood near the door with her candle in her hand, holding her breath. Then she crept across the room, and as she drew nearer, the light attracted the boy's attention, and he turned his head on his pillow and stared at her, his grey eyes opening so wide that they seemed immense. "Who are you?" he said at last in a half-frightened whisper. "Are you a ghost?" "No, I'm not," Mary answered, her own whisper sounding half-frightened. "Are you one?" He stared and stared and stared. Mary could not help noticing what strange eyes he had. They were agate grey, and they looked too big for his face because they had black lashes all round them. "No," he replied after waiting a moment or so. "I am Colin." Who is Colin?" she faltered. "I am Colin Craven. Who are you?" "I am Mary Lennox. Mr. Craven is my uncle." "He's my father," said the boy. "Your father?" gasped Mary. "No one ever told me he had a boy. Why didn't they?" "Because I should have been afraid you would see me. I won't let people see me and talk me over." "Why?" Mary asked again, feeling more mystified every moment. "Because I'm like this, always ill and having to lie down. My father won't let people talk me over either. The servants are not allowed to speak about me. If I live, I may be a hunchback, but I shan't live. My father hates to think I may be like him." "Does your father come and see you?" Mary ventured. "Sometimes. Generally when I am asleep. He doesn't want to see me." "Why?" Mary could not help asking again. A sort of angry shadow passed over the boy's face. "My mother died when I was born, and it makes him wretched to look at me. He thinks I don't know, but I've heard people talking. He almost hates me." "How old are you?" he asked. I am 10, answered Mary, forgetting herself for the moment. And so are you." "How do you know that?" he demanded in a surprised voice. "Because when you were born the garden door was locked and the key was buried, and it has been locked for 10 years. Colin half sat up, turning toward her, leaning on his elbows. "What garden door was locked? Who did it? Where was the key buried?" he exclaimed, as if he was suddenly very much interested. It was the garden Mr. Craven hates," said Mary nervously. "He locked the door. No one knew where he buried the key." "What sort of a garden is it?" Colin persisted eagerly. "No one has been allowed to go into it for 10 years, was Mary's careful answer. "I wouldn't make them," said Colin. Could you?" Mary faltered, beginning to feel frightened. If he could make people answer questions, who knew what might happen? "Everyone is obliged to please me. I told you that," he said. "If I were to live, this place would sometime belong to me. They all know that. I would make them tell me." Do you want to live?" inquired Mary. "No," he answered in a cross, tired fashion. "But I don't want to die. Let us talk about something else. Talk about that garden. Don't you want to see it?" "Yes," answered Mary, in quite a low voice. "I do," he went on persistently. "I don't think I ever really wanted to see anything before, but I want to see that garden. I want the key dug up. I want the door unlocked." "Oh, don't do that," she cried out. He stared as if he thought she had gone crazy. "Why?" he exclaimed. "You said you wanted to see it." "I do," she answered, almost with a sob in her throat. "But if you make them open the door and take you in like that, it will never be a secret again." He leaned still farther forward. "A secret," he said. "What do you mean? Tell me." Mary's words almost tumbled over one another. "You see," You see, she panted, if no one knows but ourselves, if there was a door hidden somewhere under the ivy, if there was and we could find it, and if we could slip through it together and shut it behind us and no one knew anyone was inside, and we called it our garden and pretended that we were missel thrushes and it was our nest, and if we played there almost every day and dug and planted seeds and made it all come alive. I never had a secret, he said. If you won't make them take you to the garden, pleaded Mary, perhaps... I feel almost sure I can find out how to get in sometime. I should like that, he said very slowly, his eyes looking dreamy. I should like that. I should not mind fresh air in a secret garden. Shut your eyes, said Mary, drawing her footstool closer, and I will do what my Aya used to do in India. I will pat your hand and stroke it, and sing something quite low. I should like that, perhaps, he said drowsily. Martha was so busy that Mary had no opportunity of talking to her, but in the afternoon she asked her to come and sit with her in the nursery. She came bringing the stocking she was always knitting when she was doing nothing else. "What's the matter with thee?" she asked as soon as they sat down. "Thou looks as if thou'd something to say." I have found out what the crying was," said Mary. Martha let her knitting drop on her knee and gazed at her with startled eyes. "Thou hasn't," she exclaimed. "Never." "I heard it in the night," Mary went on, "and I got up and went to see where it came from. It was Colin. I found him." Mary's face became red with fright. "Eh, Miss Mary," she said, half crying. "Thou shouldn't have done it, thou shouldn't. Thou'll get me in trouble. I never told thee nothing about him, but thou'll get me in trouble. I shall lose my place, and what'll mother do?" "You won't lose your place," said Mary. "He was glad I came. We talked and talked, and he said he was glad I came." Just then Martha's bell rang. "I dare say the nurse wants me to stay with him a bit," she said. "I hope he's in good temper." She was out of the room about 10 minutes, and then she came back with a puzzled expression. "Well, thou's bewitched him," she said. "He's up on his sofa with his picture books. He's told the nurse to stay away until 6 o'clock. I'm to wait in the next room. The minute she was gone, he called me to him and says, 'I want Mary Lennox to come and talk to me, and remember you're not to tell anyone. You'd better go as quick as you can.'" There was a bright fire on the hearth when she entered his room, and in the daylight she saw it was a very beautiful room indeed. Colin looked rather like a picture himself. He was wrapped in a velvet dressing gown and sat against a big brocaded cushion. He had a red spot on each cheek. "I was thinking," said Mary, "how different you are from Dickon." "Who is Dickon?" he said. "What a queer name." "He is Martha's brother. He's 12 years old," she explained. "He's not like anyone else in the world. He knows about everything that grows or lives on the moor." "I couldn't go to the moor," he said in a resentful tone. Mary was silent for a while, and then she said something bold. "You might, sometime." He moved as if he was startled. "Go on the moor? How could I? I'm going to die." "How do you know?" said Mary unsympathetically. "Oh, I've heard it ever since I remember," he answered crossly. And then he lay back on his cushion and was still as if he were thinking, and there was quite a long silence. "Do you know there is one thing we have never once thought of," he said. "We are cousins." It seemed so queer that they talked so much and never remembered this simple thing that they laughed more than ever because they'd got into the humour to laugh at anything. And in the midst of the fun the door opened and in walked Dr. Craven and Mrs. Medlock. "Good Lord!" exclaimed poor Mrs. Medlock with her eyes almost starting out of her head. "Good Lord!" "What is this?" said Dr. Craven, coming forward. "What does it mean?" "This is my cousin, Mary Lennox. I asked her to come and talk to me. I like her. She must come and talk to me whenever I send for her." Mary saw that Dr. Craven did not look pleased, but it was quite plain that he did not dare oppose his patient. He sat down by Colin and felt his pulse. "I'm afraid there's been too much excitement. Excitement is not good for you, my boy," he said. "I should be excited if she kept away," answered Colin, his eyes beginning to look dangerously sparkling. "I am better. She makes me better. The nurse must bring up her tea with mine. We will have tea together." "Now, if you'll eat, I will," he said as the tea arrived. "These muffins look so nice and hot. Tell me about Rogers." Of course, Mary did not waken early the next morning. She had her hat on when she appeared in Colin's room, and for a second he looked disappointed. He was in bed, and his face was pitifully white, and there were dark circles round his eyes. "I'm glad you came," he said. "My head aches, and I ache all over because I'm so tired. You going somewhere?" Mary went and leaned against his bed. "I won't be long," she said. "I'm going to Dickon, but I'll come back." Mary was so anxious that she got up from her stool and came to him and caught hold of both his hands. "Colin, can I trust you? I trusted Dickon because birds trusted him. Can I trust you for sure, she implored. Her face was so solemn that he almost whispered his answer. "Yes, yes. Well, Dickon will come to see you tomorrow morning, and he'll bring his creatures with him." Oh, Colin cried in delight. "But that's not all," Mary went on, almost pale with solemn excitement. "The rest is better. There is a door into the garden. I found it. It is under the ivy on the wall." "Oh, Mary," he cried out with a half-sob, "shall I see it? Shall I get into it? Shall I live to get into it?" And he clutched her hands and dragged her toward him. "Of course you'll see it," snapped Mary indignantly. "Of course you'll live to get into it. Don't be silly." Mary hesitated about 2 minutes and then boldly spoke the truth. "I have seen it, and I had been in," she said. "I found the key and got in weeks ago, but I daren't tell you. I daren't because I was so afraid I couldn't trust you for sure." When Dr. Craven appeared next, he was informed by the Rajah of an entirely new development. "I am going out in my chair in a day or two, if it is fine. I want some fresh air." "I thought you did not like fresh air," he said. "I don't when I am by myself," replied the Rajah, "but my cousin is going out with me. My cousin knows how to take care of me. I am always better when she is with me. She made me better last night. A very strong boy I know will push my carriage." "He must be a strong and steady boy," said Dr. Craven, "and I must know something about him. Who is he? What is his name?" It's Dickon," Mary spoke up suddenly. She felt somehow that everybody who knew the moor must know Dickon, and she was right, too. She saw that in a moment Dr. Craven's serious face relaxed into a relieved smile. That night Colin slept without once awakening, and he had not been awake more than 10 minutes when he heard feet running along the corridor, and Mary was at the door. You've been out, and there's that nice smell of leaves," he cried. She'd been running, and her hair was loose and blown, and she was bright with the air and pink-cheeked, though he could not see it. "It's so beautiful," she said, a little breathless with her speed. "You never saw anything so beautiful. It has come. I thought it had come the other morning, but it was only coming. It is here now. It has come, the spring. Dickon says so." When Colin was on his sofa and the breakfast for two was put upon the table, he made an announcement to the nurse in his most Rajah-like manner. "A boy and a fox and a crow and 2 squirrels and a newborn lamb are coming to see me this morning. I want them brought upstairs as soon as they come," he said. "You are not to begin playing with the animals in the servants' hall and keep them there. I want them here." In about 10 minutes, Mary held up her hand. "Listen," she said. "Did you hear a call?" If you please, sir," announced Martha, opening the door. "If you please, sir, here's Dickon and his creatures." Dickon came in smiling his nicest wide smile. The newborn lamb was in his arms, and the little red fox trotted by his side. Nut sat on his left shoulder, and Soot on his right, and Shell's head and paws peeped out of his coat pocket. He walked over to Colin's sofa and put the newborn lamb quietly on his lap, and immediately the little creature turned to the warm velvet dressing gown and began to nuzzle and nuzzle into its folds and butt its tight-curled head with soft impatience against his side. Of course, no boy could have helped speaking then. "What is it doing?" cried Colin. "What does it want?" "It wants its mother," said Dickon, smiling more and more. "I brought it to thee a bit hungry because I knowed thou'd like to see it feed." He knelt down by the sofa and took a feeding bottle from his pocket. After that there was no wondering what to say. By the time the lamb fell asleep, questions poured forth, and Dickon answered them all. Soon after Dickon's visit, Colin sent for Mr. Roach, the head gardener. "Oh, you are Roach, are you?" he said. "I sent for you to give you some very important orders." "I am going out in my chair this afternoon," said Colin. "If the fresh air agrees with me, I may go out every day. When I go, none of the gardeners are to be anywhere near the long walk by the garden walls. No one is to be there. I shall go out about 2 o'clock, and everyone must be kept away until I send word that they may go back to their work." "Very good, sir," replied Mr. Roach. They looked at the pictures in the gardening books, and Dickon knew all the flowers by their country names, and knew exactly which ones were already growing in the secret garden. "I'm going to see them," cried Colin. "I am going to see them." "Aye, that thou must," said Mary quite seriously, "and thou munnot lose no time about it." A little later the nurse made Colin ready. The strongest footman in the house carried him downstairs and put him in his wheeled chair, near which Dickon waited outside. After the manservant had arranged his rugs and cushions, the Rajah waved his hand to him and to the nurse. Dickon began to push the wheeled chair slowly and steadily. Mistress Mary walked beside it, and Colin leaned back and lifted his face to the sky. Not a human creature was to be caught sight of in the paths they took. When at last they turned into the long walk by the ivied walls, the excited sense of an approaching thrill made them, for some curious reason they could not have explained, begin to speak in whispers. "This is it," breathed Mary. "This is where I used to walk up and down and wonder and wonder." "Is it?" cried Colin, and his eyes began to search the ivy with eager curiousness. "But I can see nothing," he whispered. "There is no door." "That's what I thought," said Mary. Then there was a lovely, breathless silence, and the chair wheeled on. "And this," said Mary, stepping onto the bed close to the ivy, "is where I went to talk to him when he chirped at me from the top of the wall. And this is the ivy the wind blew back." And she took hold of the hanging green curtain. "Oh, is it? Is it?" gasped Colin. "And here is the handle, and here is the door. Dickon, push him in quickly." Dickon did it with one strong, steady, splendid push. But Colin had actually dropped back against his cushions, even though he gasped with delight, and had covered his eyes with his hands and held them there, shutting out everything until they were inside, and the chair stopped as if by magic, and the door was closed. "Does thou think," said Colin with dreamy carefulness, "as happen it was made like this here all on purpose for me?" "My word," said Mary admiringly, "that there is a bit of good Yorkshire. That shaping first rate, that." And delight reigned. "I don't want this afternoon to go," Colin said, "but I shall come back tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after, and the day after." "You'll get plenty of fresh air, won't you?" said Mary. Colin half lifted his head and exclaimed, "Who is that man?" Dickon and Mary scrambled to their feet. "Man!" they both cried in low, quick voices. Colin pointed to the high wall. "Look," he whispered excitedly, "just look." Mary and Dickon wheeled about and looked. There was Ben Weatherstaff's indignant face glaring at them over the wall from the top of a ladder. He actually shook his fist at Mary. "If I wasn't a bachelor, and thou was a wench of mine," he cried, "I'd give thee a hiding." He mounted another step threateningly, as if it were his energetic intention to jump down and deal with her, but as she came toward him he evidently thought better of it, and stood on the top step of his ladder, shaking his fist down at her. "I never thought much of thee," he harangued. "I couldn't abide thee at first time I set eyes on thee. A scrawny, buttermilk-faced young besom, allus asking questions and poking thy nose where it wasn't wanted. I never knowed how thou got so thick with me. If it hadn't been for the robin, drat him." At the first sound of his torrent of words, Colin had been so surprised that he had only sat up and listened as if he was spellbound. But in the midst of it he had recovered himself and beckoned imperiously to Dickon. "Wheel me over there," he commanded. "Wheel me quite close and stop in front of him." "Do you know who I am?" demanded the Rajah. How Ben Weatherstaff stared. "Do you know who I am?" demanded Colin still more imperiously. "Answer." "Who that?" he said. "Aye, that I do, with thy mother's eyes staring at me out of thy face. Lord knows how thou come here, but thou'rt the poor cripple." There was a brief fierce scramble, the rugs were tossed onto the ground. Dickon held Colin's arm, the thin legs were out, the thin feet were on the grass.
"I'm your master," he said, "when my father is away, and you are to obey me. This is my garden. Don't dare say a word about it. You get down from that ladder and go out to the long walk, and Miss Mary will meet you and bring you here. I want to talk to you." Ben Weatherstaff's crabbed old face obediently disappeared as he descended the ladder. When Ben Weatherstaff came through the door in the wall, he saw him standing there. "Look at me," Colin commanded. "Look at me, all over. Am I a hunchback?" Ben Weatherstaff had not quite got over his emotion, but he had recovered a little and answered almost in his usual way. "Not that," he answered, "not of the sort." The Rajah condescended to seat himself on a rug under the tree. "What work do you do in the gardens, Weatherstaff?" he inquired. "Anything I'm told to do," answered old Ben. "I'm kept on by favour because she liked me." "She," said Colin. "Thy mother," answered Ben Weatherstaff. My mother," said Colin, and he looked about him quietly. This was her garden, wasn't it? Aye, it was that, and Ben Weatherstaff looked about him too. She were main fond of it. "It is my garden now. I am fond of it. I shall come here every day," announced Colin, "but it is to be a secret. My orders are that no one is to know that we come here. Dickon and my cousin have worked and made it come alive. I shall send for you sometime to help, but you must come when no one can see you." Ben Weatherstaff's face twisted itself in a dry old smile. "I've come here before when no one saw me," he said. "What?" exclaimed Colin. "When?" "The last time I was here," rubbing his chin and looking round, "was about 2 years ago." "Thou come and did a bit of pruning," cried Dickon. "I couldn't make out how it had been done." "She was so fond of it, she was," said Ben Weatherstaff slowly. "And she was such a pretty young thing. She says to me once, 'Ben,' she says to me laughing, 'if ever I'm ill or I go away, you must take care of my roses.' When she did go away, the orders was that no one was ever to come nigh. But I come, with grumpy obstinacy. Over the wall I come, until the rheumatics stopped me, and I did a bit of work once a year. She'd given her order first." "I'm glad you did it, Weatherstaff," said Colin. "You'll know how to keep the secret." While the secret garden was coming alive, and 2 children were coming alive with it, there was a man wandering about certain far-away beautiful places in the Norwegian fjords and the valleys and mountains of Switzerland, and he was a man who, for 10 years, had kept his mind filled with dark and heartbroken thinking. He had not been courageous. He had never tried to put any other thoughts in the place of the dark ones. He had wandered by blue lakes and thought them. He had lain on mountain-sides with sheets of deep blue gentians blooming all about him and flower breaths filling all the air, and he had thought them. A terrible sorrow had fallen upon him when he had been happy, and he had let his soul fill itself with blackness, and had refused obstinately to allow any rift of light to pierce through. He had forgotten and deserted his home and his duties. As he sat gazing into the clear running of the water, Archibald Craven gradually felt his mind and body both grow quiet as the valley itself. He wondered if he were going to sleep, but he was not. He sat and gazed at the sunlit water, and his eyes began to see things growing at its edge. "What is it?" he said, almost in a whisper, and he passed his hand over his forehead. "I almost feel as if I were alive." He began to think of Misselthwaite and wonder if he should not go home. "I will go back to Misselthwaite," he said aloud. Yes, I'll go at once." In a few days he was in Yorkshire again, and on his long railroad journey he found himself thinking of his boy as he had never thought in all the 10 years past. "Perhaps I have been all wrong for 10 years, he said to himself. 10 years is a long time. It may be too late to do anything, quite too late. What have I been thinking of?" When he arrived at the manor, the servants who received him with the usual ceremony noticed that he looked better, and that he did not go to the remote rooms where he usually lived, attended by Pitcher. He went into the library and sent for Mrs. Medlock. She came to him somewhat excited and curious and flustered. "Where is Master Colin?" Mr. Craven asked. "In the garden, sir. He's always in the garden, though not a human creature is allowed to go near for fear they'll look at him." Mr. Craven scarcely heard her last words. "In the garden," he said,
and after he had sent Mrs. Medlock away, he stood and repeated it again and again. In the garden. He turned and went out of the room. He took his way, as Mary had done, through the door in the shrubbery and among the laurels and the fountain beds. The fountain was playing now and was encircled by beds of brilliant autumn flowers. He crossed the lawn and turned into the long walk by the ivied walls. He did not walk quickly but slowly, and his eyes were on the path. He felt as if he were being drawn back to the place he had so long forsaken, and he did not know why. As he drew near it, his step became still more slow. He knew where the door was, even though the ivy hung thick over it, but he did not know exactly where it lay, that buried key. So he stopped and stood still, looking about him, and almost the moment after he had paused, he started and listened, asking himself if he were walking in a dream. What in heaven's name was he dreaming of? What in heaven's name did he hear? And then the moment came, the uncontrollable moment, when the sounds forgot to hush themselves. The feet ran faster and faster. They were nearing the garden door. There was quick, strong young breathing and a wild outbreak of laughing shouts which could not be contained, and the door in the wall was flung wide open, the sheet of ivy swinging back, and a boy burst through it at full speed and, without seeing the outsider, dashed almost into his arms. He was a tall boy and a handsome one. He was glowing with life, and his running had sent splendid colour leaping to his face. He threw the thick hair back from his forehead and lifted a pair of strange grey eyes, eyes full of boyish laughter and rimmed with black lashes like a fringe. It was the eyes which made Mr. Craven gasp for breath. "Who? What? Who?" he stammered. "Father," he said, "I'm Colin. You can't believe it. I scarcely can myself. I'm Colin." Colin put out his hand and laid it on his father's arm. "Aren't you glad, Father?" he ended. "Aren't you glad? I'm going to live for ever and ever and ever." Mr. Craven put his hands on both the boy's shoulders and held him still. He knew he dared not even try to speak for a moment. "Take me into the garden, my boy," he said at last, "and tell me all about it." And so they led him in. Ben Weatherstaff's duties rarely took him away from the gardens, but on this occasion he made an excuse to carry some vegetables to the kitchen, and being invited into the servants' hall by Mrs. Medlock to drink a glass of beer, he was on the spot, as he had hoped to be, when the most dramatic event Misselthwaite Manor had seen during the present generation actually took place. "Did you see either of them, Weatherstaff?" Mrs. Medlock asked. Ben took his beer mug from his mouth and wiped his lips with the back of his hand. "Aye, that I did," he answered, with a shrewdly significant air. "Where was Master Colin? How did he look? What did they say to each other?" "Look there," he said, "if thou's curious. Look what's coming across the grass." When Mrs. Medlock looked, she threw up her hands and gave a little shriek, and every man and woman servant within hearing bolted across the servants' hall and stood looking through the window with their eyes almost starting out of their heads. Across the lawn came the master of Misselthwaite, and he looked as many of them had never seen him. And by his side, with his head up in the air and his eyes full of laughter, walked as strongly and steadily as any boy in Yorkshire, Master Colin.